Tragedy strategy. Tragedies. Hello. Good morning to you. What do you like? What do you do? Hey, it's Hadar. Today I'm going to share with you the ideal morning pronunciation practice. You want to think of it as a physical workout or a yoga practice that you do in the morning to get energized for the day, but also to build muscle. And this is exactly the same thing, but in this case we're talking about the articulation organs. You want to do that in the morning to set yourself up for pronunciation success, but also to build the muscles of your articulation organs like the tongue, lips, and the jaw. Now, I recommend doing it every single day so you're more in tune with sounds that don't exist in your native language, but it's also going to help you sound more clear in your native language as well. You can do it in the morning, but you can also do it before going into a meeting or before having an important speaking gig. Okay, let's get started, but before that, if you're new to my channel, then hi and welcome, and this is the place for you if you want to speak English with clarity, with confidence, and freedom. So be sure to subscribe and click the bell to get notifications so you don't miss out on any valuable lessons. Let's begin with massaging your jaw. It's always good to become aware and kind of relax all unnecessary tension. We're going to start with that and hinge that connects between the upper jaw and the lower jaw, and usually we hold a lot of tension there, so I want you to massage it and kind of like try to release all the tension and maybe hum. We're also warming up the voice so you don't have the morning voice amped here. The cheeks and again the jaw. Maybe move it around a little bit with your hands. Okay. A little more. Okay, good. Now we're going to warm up the tongue. Let's begin by sticking the tongue out, and we're going to move it to the right and then to the left. To the right. We're going to do this 10 times. Okay, so right, right, Okay, now we're going to stick the tongue out and bring it up and down. So stick it out and Keep doing it. I'm going to keep speaking again. Push it out as if the tongue wants to come out of your mouth. 2 more. And very good. Now let's stick it out and bring it back in really fast 10 times. As far as you can. Okay, good. Let's release tension and breathe out. Okay, good. In the next exercise, we are going to clean the teeth with your tongue. So you want to move your tongue around. Keep doing it. Now, this is a really good exercise, especially before a meeting, so you make sure that you don't have green stuff or poppy seeds stuck between your teeth. I got you covered. Keep your lips closed. Good. Relax your lips. Good. Now we're going to use the tongue to massage the inside of the cheek as you're resisting the tongue with your cheek muscles. So, take your tongue, the tip of the tongue, and push it against the inside of your left cheek while the cheek is actually resisting it. So you want to push against. You want your tongue to feel like it's fighting something as you're massaging it. And get to all the different places inside your mouth. And to the right. Good. And now let's do a trill to relax the tongue. For some of you, this is going to be really easy if you have the trilled R in your language. If you don't, you can just do another lip trill. And now we're going to do it while going up and down in pitch. Massage the jaw a bit more. Very, very good. You're starting to feel your mouth, to feel the tongue, which is good because we need the tongue to articulate the sounds, and to be able to do it clearly, we need to be in control of the tongue. Now we're going to warm up the lips. So push the lips forward as if you're pushing it for a kiss, an exaggerated one, and pull it to the sides. Forward. Now try to keep the cheeks out of the way, right? You don't want to go like this. Okay, you don't want to get used to engaging your cheeks when pulling the lips. Sometimes we need that to articulate some of the sounds, like the E and the A, and we want to be able to control these muscles. So just the lips, the corners of the mouth, and forward. One more time. Okay, very good. Make sure you're not holding tension in your shoulders. Just tell your shoulders to relax. Tell your face to relax. Okay, good. Now we're going to go into a few sounds. Let's start with the tip of the tongue consonants. Let's begin with a T sound. Make sure it's just the tip of the tongue touching the upper palate. Let's do it together. It's light. And now we're going to move the tongue back a bit and switch between S and Z. Now we're going to move on to consonants created with the lips. We're going to start with a P sound where you bring the lips together and release air. And then the voiced version of it. And then we're going to go to the nasal version of it. Again. Let's add vowels to it. And we're going to use the consonant N. So we're going into an I diphthong. You want to drop your jaw and then raise the tongue for an E sound. And then we're going to go into may. Now we're going into the A and the D diphthong, starting with an A, shifting into an E. Then we're going to do a long O as in go. Good. The next diphthong is going to be moy as in toy. And finally, we're going to use the ow diphthong. Just like in mouse. So we're going to do all 5 of them, one after the other. Let's do it again. One last time. Very good. Now we're going to move to the back of the mouth, pronouncing the k and g. From there, I want you to shift to the high E sound. G. So the tongue pulls back for the g And then forward for the high E.
G-G-G, G-G-G.
And then
K-K-Key, K-K-Key.
Good. So let's do it a few times.
G-G-G, K-K-Key, G-G-G, K-K-Key.
And then from there, we're going to move on to the tense oo sound, a back open vowel sound.
G-G-Goo, 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 K-K-Koo. G-G-Goo, K-K-Koo, G-G-Goo, K-K-Koo.
Make sure you push the lips forward for the oo sound. Let's do it 2 more times.
G-G-Goo, K-K-Koo, G-G-Goo, K-K-Koo.
Very good. And now I want you to yawn. Like, raise the soft palate by yawning. Good. And let's find the voice and bring the voice to the chest. Hello, good morning. Hello, good morning. So you want to bring your voice to the chest. Hello, good morning to you. Hello, good morning to you. And then let's bring the voice to the head. Hello, good morning to you. Hello, good morning to you. You want to feel the vibrations here? Maybe a little bit to your nose. Hello, good morning to you. Hello, good morning to you. Okay, let's move on to some tongue twisters. Let's start with my favorite, unique New York, unique New York, unique New York. Let's do it again. Unique, hi-oo, hi-e, unique New York, unique New York, unique New York. Let's say it again a little faster.
Unique New York, unique New York, unique New York, unique New York,
now, as
unique
you're
New York,
moving through the
unique
day,
New
if you
York,
do it every
unique
single
New
day, you'll
York,
see that it's a lot
unique New
easier for
York,
you to
unique
say
New
it
York,
faster. The
unique
next one
New
is
York.
good blood, bad blood.
Good blood, bad blood, 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 good blood, bad blood. Good blood, bad blood, good blood, bad blood, good blood, bad blood, good blood, bad blood, good blood.
Here we have the as in cat, forward, front vowel, bad blood. Good blood, 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 bad blood. The next one is tragedy, strategy.
Tragedy, strategy, 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 strategy.
Good. I used to confuse this one all of the time. Let's do some TH warm-ups. So let's start with just sticking the tongue out and pronouncing a voiced TH versus a voiceless TH. Now we're going to work on transitions. N to TH. L to TH. You can also use the voiceless TH. Very good. And now STH. Make sure you stick the tongue out. The tongue is not too tight against the teeth, so the air comes out. Let's do it a few more times. Very good. Relax your lips. Release air. And massage your jaw again. Good. Very good. Finally, let's do some chunks. What do you? 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 What do you want? What do you want? What do you want? What do you want? What do you like? What do you like?
What do you like? What do you like? What do you like? What do you do? What do you do? What do you do?
What do you say?
What do you say? What do you say? What do you say?
Next one is going to go.
Gonna go, gonna go, gonna go, gonna go. Gonna go, gonna go, gonna go, gonna go, gonna go. I'm gonna go. I'm gonna go. I'm gonna go. I'm gonna go. She's gonna go. She's gonna go. She's gonna go. She's gonna go. I'm gonna go home. I'm gonna go home. I'm gonna go home. I'm gonna go home. I'm gonna go
I'm
home.
gonna go to the
I'm
office.
going to the office. I'm 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 going to the office.
Next one is could have. Could
Could
have.
have.
Coulda.
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 Coulda. Coulda.
Notice that the D is really, really light. It sounds like a flap T, like a ra, like an R in Spanish. Ra, pero, coulda, coulda, coulda. I 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 could have done that. I could have done that. I could have seen it. I could have seen it. I could have been there. I could have been there. I could have done it. I could have done it. I could have seen it. I could have seen it. I could have been there. I could have been there. Coulda, 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 coulda. Shoulda, 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 shoulda. Should have. Shoulda, 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 shoulda. Woulda, 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 woulda. Would have.
Woulda, 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 woulda. Coulda, shoulda, woulda. Coulda, shoulda, woulda. Coulda, shoulda, woulda.
Okay, that's it. To wrap it up, I want you to put your palm on your belly, one on your belly, one on your chest, and try to breathe into the hand that is on the belly. And breathe out. Close your eyes. Breathe in to your belly, out to your chest, and breathe out. And last time, and as you exhale, you can also release a sound. Breathe into your belly. Okay, that's it. As I said in the beginning, I recommend doing it every single day. And when you do, you will feel the improvement and how easier it is for you to articulate sounds in English and in your native language as well. Now, to make it fun and to hold each other accountable, every time you complete this exercise, write in the comments, done. So we know that you did it again today. Have a beautiful, beautiful day, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.
Naruto. Naruto. Believe it. Believe it. Yeah. Jeez, bro. How long time? 300. Susan was alone in the big living room at Portuguese Place. It was 8 o'clock in the evening and already dark. She had a simple meal. The servants had gone out to their huts. She took up her sewing and sat by an oil lamp, but after 10 minutes she put it down again. She picked up last week's newspaper and read 1 or 2 items about cattle sales, but lost interest in that too. She felt unsettled, without knowing why. It was something that was happening to her more and more frequently. A kind of boredom, which she hardly even admitted to herself. For with her background, boredom was equated with sin, When Franz was with her, it was all right, but more and more frequently he was making the journey to Kimberley to buy and sell stock, and Marie went with him. He had tried at first to dissuade her, but the arguments had been so fierce that he had finally given in. This meant that Susan was increasingly left on her own. In the early days, there would have been 1,000 things to do, but not now. If she wanted curtains made for the sitting room, there were half a dozen women in Kimberley who would make them better than she could. If she wanted soap, she bought it at Levinson's. If she needed a new dress, she found it at Thompson's Modes. Shoes, she bought at Thomas's. The servants did everything she used to do in the house. Why should you do it? Franz had said many times. You've had your turn. Now we have money to pay others. In a way, he was right. It would have been pointless to try and turn the clock back and work as she had done when they had first married. She spent as much time as she could in the garden. She was creating down near the river. For weeks she had planned paths and had walls built. The original scheme to grow maize had been supplanted by her need to create something more personal. In any case, as Franz had pointed out, this was cattle and sheep country. But she could not be supervising the garden every minute of the day. The gap in her life had a profound effect on her. It gave her time to think, and thought meant worry. She worried always about what was to become of Mary, and thoughts of Marie took her mind back to the past. She had hoped to bury it, to erase the memory of Captain, but it had lain in her subconscious, festering away without her knowing it, until now it re-emerged as a kind of throbbing sore. She remembered again things that she had long since thought to have forgotten. The little bushman woman who had looked after her. Whatever had happened to them? She knew that nowadays white men hunted down bushmen as vermin. People said there were few of them left. She recalled Mr. Barker in his dusty black with his two services every day, one for white people and one for non-whites. She even remembered the hard ship's biscuits that she had dunked in the tea which tasted of earthy river water. When these memories crowded in as they did now, she would go in search of the big Portuguese Bible. She now had a Bible of her own, in English, from which she read every day. But she drew a strength from holding the old Portuguese one which seemed to come from nowhere else. Now she crossed the room, fetched it from its shelf, and took it back to her chair. Slowly, as she often did, she turned the sun-stained pages. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. She tried to pronounce the Portuguese words, but they defeated her. She looked again at the spidery writing that covered so many pages in the margins above and below the black biblical type. And, as she had so many times before, she wondered who had written it, and why, and what it said. She could make out occasional figures and had decided these must be days of the month. But that was all. In some places, the writing was almost illegible. How had it come to their muddle? How had the crucifix got in the river? Had this Bible once belonged to Portuguese settlers? But she had never heard of any Portuguese settlers. A Portuguese woman, perhaps, who had married an Englishman or a Frenchman. Was this her Bible? And what had happened to her? Had the Koranas found her too? Immediately, the picture of Captain arose again in her mind. The skin, the color of old ivory, the long black hair, the dark brown eyes, the handsome face. Were these some of the features she saw in a daughter? She gripped the Bible again, smoothing the rough leather cover. If only she could tell someone, she thought. If only she could tell everything as it had happened. Perhaps that might exorcise these ghosts from the past which rose up now so frequently to haunt her. But she could not tell Franz, and she could not tell Marie, and there was no one else. She heard the dogs begin to bark behind the house, and soon there came the noise of the trap arriving and Franz's voice shouting for the servants to unharness the horses and carry the parcels into the house. She rose and went to the door. Marie came up the steps and pushed past her without a greeting, a thunderous expression on her face. She went on down the passage to her room and slammed the door. In a few minutes, Franz limped in and she made herself busy fetching him coffee, cold meat, and bread. She could have rung a handbell for one of the servants, but it gave her pleasure to be doing something. When he had finished, he sat in his chair and folded paper and drew on it slowly, and all at once her world became a less thorny place. "What did you do?" she said. "I sold all those Hamels," he said, referring to a couple of hundred wethers he had kept back from the previous week's sales because of low prices. Old Levinson thought he'd get them cheaply, but I said to Hal, if I have to drive them back to the farm, I'll do it. He wanted to give me a check. You remember he tried that about a year ago, but I said no checks. He says he's afraid I'm going to lose the cash if I don't put it in the bank. He says checks are easier. I said, you just give me the cash. Don't you worry about me. Don't you think you should open a bank account? What for? I just have to take the money out again. We've got enough for day-to-day expenses. The rest goes back into stock. That's my bank. He jerked his thumb at the invisible animals beyond the walls of the house. Did you buy anything? Yeah. Cattle. There were some brought down from the north. I'm not sure where, but they looked good. Tough. I thought we might fatten them up, maybe even breed them with our own. Helmut bought some too. Is there any more coffee? She poured him another cup. Marie seemed upset, she said. Was it only her imagination, or had the quality of her voice changed when she used Marie's name? They did not discuss her much. Both seemed to shy away from the subject. I don't know. She disappeared, of course. Went to see her friends. When she came back to meet me in the square, she wasn't herself. I didn't like to ask why. She didn't speak all the way home. What's the news? Susan said, changing the subject with some relief. Franz always picked up a little gossip. He shrugged. The prices of diamonds are down because of overproduction. They say that chap C.J. Rhodes is trying to control production by buying up claims. Did you see Jack? No, but old Levinson tells me he's not at the tent much anymore. He's taken up with some extras or singer. My God, but I'm tired. Sometimes his face looked ash-gray with fatigue after a trip into Kimberley. He had lost a lot of weight in his late 40s, and now he was a rather gaunt, thin, sun-wrinkled man who looked older than he really was. Sometimes she thought that of herself too. Once she remembered she had looked at herself in a cracked glass in Mr. Parker's wagon and faced the reality of her plainness. Now she avoided looking in mirrors and was thankful that there was still something left between Franz and herself. As she undressed and got into bed beside him, she remembered what he had said about Jack and knew exactly why Marie had been upset. During the next few weeks, Franz went into Kimberley on average twice a week, and each time Marie made an excuse not to go. She kept to herself. When she was not brooding in her room, Susan would see her walking down by the river. This gave her something new to be concerned about. She had worried at the thought of her daughter, headstrong and willful, being let loose in Kimberley with its undercurrent of low life. But it was equally dangerous, it seemed to her, for the girl to be isolated at Portuguese Place. She had always hoped that one day Marie would marry and that she would live on the farm. Susan and Franz could build a smaller house some distance away, a kind of dower house, and she could watch her grandchildren growing up. But how would Marie marry if she never met anyone? Slowly, she began to reconsider something that Marie had talked about, but which both she and Franz had dismissed as nonsense. That was her idea of buying a house in Kimberley where they could spend part of the year. The more she thought about it, the more it seemed to give promise of an answer to her problem. Marie in Kimberley by herself was one thing, but Marie chaperoned as part of a family. Marie with a house and a background in the town. That was quite another. But she knew that Franz would not agree. It was something she would have to come at obliquely. Better still, it was an idea which should appear to come from Franz himself. She waited for an opportunity. It came sooner than she expected, and in a way she would never have wanted. Late one afternoon, he brought in a lamb that had been bitten by a jackal. He had found it about a mile from the homestead and, as he usually did, had slung it over his shoulders. She had seen him do this 1,000 times without coming to any harm. But that evening, after supper, he stumbled while crossing the living room and steadied himself like an old man by grasping the back of a chair. His legs seemed weak and wobbly. "What is it?" she said, coming to help him. Nothing. I feel a little giddy. I think I'll go to bed. I'll be all right in the morning." But he was not all right. He found that the moment he put his feet on the floor, he could not hold his balance. I'm going to get you into I'm going to get you into town to a doctor," Susan said. There's nothing the matter with me. I'm a bit tired, that's all." But she called the servants, told them to get the trap ready, and she and Marie took him to Kimberley. He sat, slumped and old, between them. Their doctor, whom they had hardly ever consulted, was an Englishman called Herbert. His rooms were above a bank in the square, and after he had examined Franz, he came out to the waiting room. He was a small, thin-faced, precise man who wore pince nez, and who had a nervous mannerism of polishing them with a silk handkerchief. Now, as he breathed on the lenses, he said, "There's nothing seriously wrong with him except Anno Domini. He's been overdoing it." He tapped himself over the heart. This is where it tells. He's not as young as he was, and his heart is not as good as it was. What he needs is rest, and he's to stop carrying heavy loads. The main thing is to take it easy. You must let someone else do the picking up and the carrying. That's what servants are for, isn't it? They went to Madame Delatte's for a cup of tea, and by the time they had done their shopping, it was nearly 5 o'clock, and Susan said, It's too late to go home now." "Of course we must go home," Franz said. "Where will we sleep?" "At the Central Hotel." "At the hotel?" He said it as though the idea was totally outlandish. "Yes," she said firmly. "That's exactly where we are going to do. Oh, fuck. That's exactly what we're going to do." He had never slept in an hotel before, and was dead against it. But she would not listen. She marched both him and Marie across to the hotel and booked the top floor suite. They had a miserable night. The beds were uncomfortable. much too soft for Franz, and the food, he said, was inedible. His normal daily diet was roast leg of mutton at midday and the same joint cold at night. The Central Hotel gave him what he called made up dishes, which he hated. Susan and Marie found the change pleasant enough. Once they returned home, she inaugurated a strict regime for Franz. She made him delegate more authority to Moperi, who was in any event an outstanding farm foreman. She made him lie down, much to his disgust, after the midday meal, and she began to nag him about his journeys into Kimberley. How are we to live if I can't go in and sell the stock and buy more? Let Moperi handle the sales. He shook his head. He's a good boy on the farm, but he could never bargain with old Levinson. She left the subject for a day or two. Then she said, what if Moperi was to look after the stock and you were to do the business in Kimberley? That's what we already do. Remember what the doctor said. It's all this traveling backwards and forwards that is tiring you out. Doctors. She decided to attack. If you won't think of yourself, think of Marie and me, she said severely. What would become of us if something happened to you? He paused. She rarely used this tone of voice, and when she did, he listened. What do you want then? I want you to travel less, and the only way that can be achieved is to stay overnight in Kimberley on the days of the sales. In that damn hotel. That would finish me sooner than anything. She decided to let the matter rest. They did not discuss it for a few days, but from Franz's silences, she could tell he was brooding. At last, one evening after supper, he said to Marie, how would you like a house in Kimberley? Marie dropped her sewing and looked up. Well, your mother thinks I shouldn't be traveling so much. I can't stand the hotel, so there isn't any other way. What a good idea, Susan said, her eyes on her own sewing. When shall we start looking? Marie said. As soon as you like. But remember, every penny we have is tied up in cattle and sheep. It will take me a month or more to get the money. Nothing. My hand. I need a haircut. Naruto. Naruto. When Susan had first known Kimberley, or the dry diggings, as it had been called then, people had lived in wagons or tents. Then had come the first wooden buildings, shops brought over in pieces from the abandoned diggings on the Vaal River. Slowly, as wealth accumulated, as merchants came, followed by professional men bringing their wives and children, people wanted more substantial homes, and these, like the Levinsons, were made of corrugated iron, mud, and wood. Then a brickyard was started, and those who could afford it had their houses built of bricks and mortar. Some were even built beyond the limits of the town, clusters of houses forming tiny suburbs. The market for houses, as for anything else, depended solely on diamonds. When prices were high, the real estate market was strong. When there was overproduction, or when heavy rain flooded parts of the diggings, or when it looked as though international events were going to cause a shortage of money to spend on diamonds, then prices for real estate sagged. Marie and Susan began to make regular journeys to Kimberley, sometimes to stay overnight at the hotel while they searched. At this time, houses were scarce. They could have had any number of wooden shacks, but Susan knew that Franz would never tolerate life in a place he hated. He had built much of Portuguese Place with his own hands, and to wean him away from it, she would have to find a house where he was both comfortable and in which he took pride. As autumn turned into winter, nothing offered itself. So she did the next best thing. She took the suite in the Central Hotel on a permanent basis, put in good beds, changed the furniture, and while Franz did not actively like it, he disliked it less than he had the first time. Her plan seemed to have worked. One of her main worries had been what would happen to Marie. In the event, the girl now seemed content to stay close to her mother. She was caught up in the search for a house, which gave her an interest she had never had before. But Susan knew there was more to her changed behavior than that, and it had to do with Jack. She heard that his love affair with the singer was continuing, and once or twice when she had asked Marie to invite him and David to dinner, Marie had made an excuse. She was spending more time at the Levinsons, and through Hilda she met other people of her own age, the sons and daughters of men like Dr. Hibbert, Mr. Agnew, the advocate, and Mr. Lowe, the magistrate, professional people, people of substance. She went to teas and dances and concerts, and Susan congratulated herself. For the first time, Marie seemed to be mixing with people of whom both she and Franz approved. It was a calm period in her life. Franz seemed better. Marie was occupied, and the farm was going well. She felt a sense of happiness, peace, and especially when she went down to a garden at Portuguese Place, achievement. Winter was the time for planning. She was going to have a quince hedge and several peach, plum, and apricot trees. Her flower beds, bare now, were ready for the spring planting. From the garden she could look up at the house standing on its south-facing slope. The grapevine had grown across the front, and its leaves were oxblood and gold. Her garden was the place to which she came more and more. It fulfilled a creative need in her. She was working there one day when she saw a movement over the low wall of riverstones, which separated her flowers from the orchard. She found she was looking at a reedbuck, a medium-sized antelope that lived in the heavy bush farther down the river and was rarely seen up at the farm. It was a doe, brown in color, and she was close enough to see the huge eyes. Fortunately, there was nothing green in the garden for it to eat. They stared at each other for a few moments, and then, instead of running away, the antelope took a few shaky steps towards her, fell onto its forelegs, struggled to rise, then rolled over on its side. She went to it. It moved its legs again, trying to stand up, but there was no strength left in them. She noticed that the breathing, quick at first, gradually grew slower. It was clearly in great distress, and she wondered if it had been bitten by a snake. She looked as closely as she could without touching it, but could see no lesion. Lesion? Its breath stank. Even as she was examining it, the breathing grew slower and finally stopped. The liquid eyes foamed over in death. She had never seen anything quite like it before, and she strolled thoughtfully back towards the house to tell one of the servants to remove it. She had still some way to go, and when she heard the sound of a horse at full gallop, she saw Moperi bring his Basutu pony to a stop at the bottom of a veranda steps in a flurry of dust. "Boss!" he shouted. Franz had been working at his stock books, and he came out. They talked for a moment, and then Mopedi pointed down towards the river past her garden where the cattle camps were. Franz limped around the back of the house, shouting for a horse. "What is it?" Susan said, catching up with him. "Mopedi says there is something wrong with the stock." In a few minutes, he and Mopedi were riding towards the river. She gave her own orders about the removal of the dead antelope and went to see how the midday meal was progressing. But Franz did not come back at midday, and it was not until later in the afternoon that she saw the two horsemen walking their animals slowly back towards the house. The light was going out of the winter afternoon, and there was a crackle of frost in the air. Franz was covered in dust, his lips rimmed. She brought him a glass of sack milk, and he slumped in his chair in front of a huge fire of camel thorn. Again, she thought, how old and tired he looked. "There's something wrong with the cattle," he said. "Mopedi found 4 bullocks dead in breakfast camp, and we went on downstream to Crucifix Camp and found more there." "How many?" "6. There were also some dead sheep." "What's caused it?" He shook his head. "I don't know. It's nothing they've eaten. There's nothing growing now. I've told Moperi to go into the hills early tomorrow and see what's happening up there." The following morning they were at breakfast when Moperi came back. He told them he had found dead animals in the hills. He reported several dead springbok, and Susan remembered the reedbuck who had died in a garden the previous day. She told Franz about it. "What do you think it can be?" she said. "God knows. Anyway, we must go and look. I want you to come with me. We'll take the wagon. Marie can come too." They filled the wagon with supplies and blankets. Franz, Moperi, Susan, and Marie were on horseback, as were half a dozen shepherds. They rode out into a grey, cold morning. A bitter wind, uh, a bitter wind was blowing the surface of the desert, and soon they tied kerchiefs over their mouths. Their faces were as grey and drawn as the day. They did not take long to come across the first dead beasts. Some cattle had died a day or two before, and their bellies were distended by gas. Others were in the process of dying, struggling to rise, falling forward and then collapsing on their sides. Many animals had died alone. Others had come together in their distress and lay huddled together in death. Vultures were everywhere, some so bloated they could no longer rise as the dull pods and their servants went past. It was like riding in a dead land, and Susan thought it had the apocalyptic horror of the Old Testament, as though God, for some angry reason of his own, had decided to strike down every living thing. All morning they passed dead and dying animals, and when they stopped in the middle of the day, no one could face the thought of eating. "Someone's riding," Marie said suddenly, squinting into the wind and pointing to a plume of dust a mile away. They watched the rider close with them, and she said, "It's Uncle Helmut." Susan was reminded of the time he had come to tell them about the first prospectus. Now his face was even grimmer. His beard was whitened by dust. "I write to warn you," he said, "but I am too late." "So it's happened to you," Franz said. "Yeah, and the Jordans. What is it? Does anyone know?" "I know. I see it in Germany before I go. It is Rinderpest." "Oh my God," Franz said. Like all stock farmers, he had heard the German word for cattle plague, but he had never knowingly seen a case, although he had heard of one or two isolated outbreaks. Most people thought the disease was still confined to Asia and Europe. "Is there any hope?" "None," Helmut said. "Have you seen the buck? They die too." "Yeah, we saw a springbuck on the way here," Susan said. "Where did it come from?" Franz asked. "From those cattle we bought," Helmut said. Franz nodded. "It must be so. Is anything safe?" "Only horses. Not so many sheep will die as cattle." "What must we do?" "Burn the corpses." "That's not possible. It would take months." As many as we can." "And then?" "Only pray it never come back." For nearly 2 weeks the Dalports and their servants stayed with the wagon, moving slowly from one stock camp to the next. The death rate was fearful among the cattle, nearly 90%, and Franz had to send the servants into Kimberley to bring out supplies of lamp oil with which to drench the corpses before setting them alight. They did not bother with single beasts, but where there were a dozen together, they would pull the bodies into a heap, saturate them, cover them with dry brush, and set them alight. The desert air became charged with the smell of burning flesh and wool. Where they could, they buried the bodies in small ravines. Occasionally, they would find groups of live sheep or cattle, and these Franz ordered to be driven into dry riverbeds and they were there shot and buried. "Who would eat this meat, knowing what had happened here?" he said. At that, at the end of the fortnight, oh, at the end of the fortnight, they all had enough. They knew that there were still scores of cattle rotting on the veldt, but there was nothing they could, nor indeed had the will to, do about them. They would be left to the sun and the rain, to the vultures and the hyenas and the ants. In a year or two there would be nothing left but whitened bones. They returned to the homestead late one afternoon. They were all tired and depressed, but Susan bore the extra worry of having seen Franz turn from middle age into an elderly man. He seemed to have shrunk even further into his skin. His dusty clothes hung on him as though they had been given as handouts from someone much larger. But the change was not only physical. Something inside him seemed to have been damaged by what had happened, and she knew it might take a long time to repair. Their future was made plain to her within the first day or two of coming home. There was no meat in the house, and nothing now to kill. She had to send Mapere out with a shotgun, and he brought back guinea fowl and a wild duck. Franz seemed to be overcome by a great lassitude. For 2 days he simply sat on the veranda staring out at the empty veldt. There were a dozen things she wanted to discuss, but she knew it was not the time. They needed supplies, and she took Marie into town. All Kimberly knew of the tragedy of the farm, and as Susan walked through the streets, she felt the glances of the passers-by. Some people, she thought, would not be too displeased at what had happened, for there were those who envied their rise in the world. But that was only human nature. Others sympathized, saying what a terrible thing it was. Some even inquired if there was any way they could help. Not unless you know how to give a man back his spirit, Susan thought. One of these was Mr. Levinson. He had wanted to go out to the farm when he first heard of the rinderpest, but Mrs. Levinson had stopped him because of his increasingly poor health. David had, David had agreed with her, but for a different reason. We'd only be in the way. We're not country people. Let them finish what they have to do. Then we can help. And so they had waited. And now Susan Delport was in town. She always bought her supplies at Levinson's, and this day was no different. I heard what happened, Mr. Levinson said, coming around the counter to greet her. And to Franz, too. Oh, it is a tragedy. Mrs. Levinson and I were only saying this morning, it is a real tragedy. Thank you. Mr. Levinson looked carefully about him, but there was no one in the store. I have something to say. Mrs. Levinson and Hilda and also David. He paused, fumbling for the words. We talked. We said to ourselves, what is happening is a terrible thing. What can we do? That is what we asked ourselves, you know. Susan waited. You're going to need capital, money for this, money for that. It takes a lot to rebuild, and Susan felt afraid to open her mouth, afraid she would not be able to speak. Slowly, she shook her head. Look, said Mr. Levinson, think of it this way. Alone, you build up your stock, we do business together again, the sooner the better. It's good for both of us. When she found her voice, Susan said, it's good of you, Mr. Levinson, but we can manage. Manage? I'm talking about business, not managing. She smiled and shook her head again. We'll be all right. Once Franz gets over it, he's pulled it up once, he can do it again. Well, when you need it, it's here. Remember that. I'll remember. It was late when they got back to Portuguese Place. The first thing she noticed was that the lamps were not lit. She ran up the steps into the living room and found Franz sitting in his chair by a dead fire. She thought he was asleep until she saw that his eyes were open. Franz? Franz? Are you all right? She said. His mouth began to work on one side and saliva dropped down his chin. She realized he was trying to speak, but could not. What's wrong? Mary said, bringing a lamp. I think he's had a seizure. Tell Nobody to write for Dr. Hibbert. It was a Sunday morning, and Jack was at his lessons in Lily's house. They had become a regular feature of his life. Every Sunday morning, he would come to her about 10 o'clock, and she would seat him at a small table with a writing block and a pencil. While he worked, she would tidy the house, dress, prepare a meal, make them both coffee. She would come regularly to see how he was getting on, and later she would make him read to her. Now she came to the table and looked over his shoulder. "What's that?" she said. "An H." He no longer pronounced it H. Under her influence, he was losing his Cockney accent. "It looks more like an N to me. Put a decent loop on it, Jack. Don't be afraid to write big. Everything else about you is big. I don't see why your handwriting shouldn't be." At first he had had to copy out line after line of single letters until he knew them both in upper and lower case. Then she had given him simple sentences. Now she was making him copy out verses from Moore's Irish Melodies. "Read me what you have written. Start at the top," she said. He put his finger under the first word and began to read. "Believe me, if all those and earring young charms which I gaze gaze which I gaze on so fondly today were to change by tomorrow and fleet in my arms like fairy gifts fading away. That's good, Jack. That's really good." She pointed to the word gaze. "Say that one again." She was very close to him. She was still in her nightgown and peignor, and he reached up and cupped her breast. "Stop that," she said briskly. "I can't concentrate if you do that." "I like to feel you," he said. "Tell me something new." She drew away. "That's not the way to learn how to read, my lad." "You know, I've been thinking," he said. "I know what you think about. I've never met such a man for thinking about it." "No, I don't mean that. I mean, I've been thinking about something in the future." "Oh, yes?" Her voice changed subtly. "Yes, when we have a house, a proper house. I've seen books in some houses, in bookcases." His fingers smoothed down the pages of Moore's Irish Melodies. There were engravings to illustrate each song. "I'd like some books with pictures in them. What sort of a house do you want, Lily?" Um, "You get on with your work," she said with a mock severity. "It doesn't do to talk to the teacher." The Sunday mornings were unique in his experience. They were a mixture of learning and domesticity which he had never known. There was an unhurried but deep pleasure to be found in watching Lily go about the shack, tidying up and washing and dusting, while he worked with his brain. It was the first time he had ever used that part of his anatomy for any academic purpose, and at first it tired him more than swinging a pick. But after a time he became used to it and would look forward to the Sunday mornings more than any other time of the week. Often now he would not see Lily for 2 or 3 days at a time. She was expanding as a singer under Peter Aaron's tutelage. Every morning he gave her singing lessons, and in the afternoons she would practice. In the evenings she would sing at the Grand. She was being sought now by other managements. The Lennian Theatre, after pressure from Aaron, had engaged her for a recital at which she had sung Schubert and Brahms, very different fare from her usual repertoire. After that, she began to be invited to give recitals at private parties and men's smokers. Jack had been to her recital at the Lennian. She had been surrounded by Errant and David and other people who made up cultured Kimberley. He had felt out of it and had left early, far preferring the body, but as he saw it, honest atmosphere of the Grand. Lily came back with coffee and stood at the door. He was bent over his work as though his life depended upon it. "All right, love," she said. "Coffee time and then reading." Today, she gave him a printed pamphlet containing the reminiscence of a British settler, which David had lent her to read. "Start there," she said. "Health, long life and growing, prosperity. Good. Made existence pleasant, but prosperity brought growing peril. The little flocks and herds of the settlers were at first tended by the sons and daughters of the owners." He broke off and said, Would would you like a farm? I mean, when I've made my fortune. I've wanted myself. It's a good life, you know. Don't worry about that now. You get on with your reading." He was about to start again when there was a knock at the front door. It was Susan Dalport. "I'm sorry to intrude on a Sunday morning," she said to Lily, "but they told me I might find Mr. Farson here." It might have been a moment of tension and embarrassment, but Lily smiled and said, "You're Mrs. Dalport, aren't you? I've heard Jack speak of you often, and you're not intruding at all. This is where you always find him every Sunday morning." Jack rose, embarrassment plain on his face. The contrast between the two women was enormous. Susan short, dumpy, with a strong lined face. Lily tall, white-skinned, and sensual. Yet somehow they seemed to complement each other. Lily brought Susan a cup of coffee and said, "I'll leave you two together." When she had gone, Susan said, "You've heard?" Jack nodded. "I would have come to help out, only, Susan was silent, waiting for him to finish. "Only, he flushed. She helped him. "There wasn't much you could do. The stock died. We burned what we could. But it finished France." "I would have come out to see him," Jack said abruptly. "Only the days ain't been long enough." "I know. I mean, there's been the digging and the work on the claim, and then you don't have to apologize, Jack. I understand. It's just that I don't want you to think you've got your own life, your own way to make." By agreeing with him, she seemed to make it worse. "We could do with a little help now, though, Jack." That's what I'm trying to say, Susan. I just ain't got no time at all. Franz needs help, and it won't be before long. A couple of weeks just till we're on our feet again. And there's David. I can't let him work on his own. I saw David on the way here. He offered to come himself, but it's your muscles we need, Jack, not David's." She caught herself just in time, but the word brains hung in the air like a ghostly sign. Jack rose and let the anger come to him. It was what he needed, an excuse to do what he had intended all along, to refuse her. For the first time in his life, things were going for him. He wasn't going to jeopardize that because ill luck had struck at someone else. He knew ill luck of old. It had been his constant companion. You had to get on with it as best you could. Wait, Jack, Susan said. I guess I made that sound bad. It wasn't what I meant. What I meant was that the job's too big for David, too big for most people. It needs a big man, a man like you. It's like I said, Susan. I ain't got a minute of my own. Why, look at me now, even on a Sunday morning. A shadow seemed to pass over her face. Then she said, We'd pay, Jack. We wouldn't expect you to work for nothing. There's no money, no cash. That's it. But there's land. There's enough land at Portuguese Place to square up. I like to, but I'm talking about a farm, Jack. Something of your own. You can't dig all your life. Abruptly, her own anger, created out of days and weeks of worry, began to flicker inside her. I've said enough. I'll be in the square until noon. If you're coming, find me there. She closed the door quickly behind her. Jack stood uncertainly in the center of the room. Lily came in. Her eyes were angry. She wanted me to go out to the farm, he said. They've had that cattle plague. Oh, I know all about it, I heard. I didn't listen by choice. She banged on the thin walls. And by God, Jack, I tried not to when I heard what was said. Now, wait a minute, Lily. What are you, Jack? I thought we were the same. She shook her head. In a way, they were the same. From the same backgrounds. This is what had partly attracted her to him. The sympathy for someone struggling, as she had struggled, to get away from the London slums. It was true that in the London she knew, and from which they had both emerged, life was so hard that altruism was a luxury no one could afford. And yet those very slums produced a kindness and a concern for the downtrodden, because they were downtrodden. A camaraderie, a sentimental affection, a rough and bluff concern for your fellow man. In a word, humanity. And it was this that was lacking in Jack. Perhaps, she thought, his life had been too brutal. Perhaps he had not lived long enough in London for some of its benefits to accrue. Perhaps the life he had led had not prepared him for situations like the one he now faced. I wanted to stay with you, he blurted. I know, Jack. I know. And I'm flattered. She was speaking to him as though he was a small boy. But you love the Delports. You've told me before how they helped you. I know, but it was as though she was seeing him for the first time, the big, raw-boned miner, whose very roughness and animal quality had taken her fancy. She had seen in him a quality of simplicity, almost of innocence, which had attracted her. He needed someone's help, and she had offered it. But now all her instincts, developed since the age of 16, when she had taken to the road, began to send up warning signals. More and more Jack was talking about a future which encompassed her. More and more he was trying to exert rights over her that did not exist. She was her own woman. No man was ever going to swamp her. Subtly, she changed her tack. You've had a bit of luck with the diamonds lately, but you know it can't last. You know it's here one day and gone the next. I heard what Mrs. Talport said about giving you land. Think of your future if you won't think of anything else. You don't want to end up like that Scotsman you told me about, do you? Dying in your tent with only a black man for company. Jack absorbed what she was saying and then said slowly, When I've made my pal, I could build out there. I've always liked it. There's a space and clean air, not this blooded dust all the time. We Could build a great house, Lily, and come into town when we oh, mine too, and keep horses. You'd like horses, and steady Jack. That's looking far ahead. The thought of living on a farm in the desert appalled her. She was no Susan Dogport. No, she was going to make something of herself. That had always been her dream. Her future seemed more and more to be tied to Peter Aaron, who had said that if she was properly, properly trained, there was nothing she could do not to. She wanted very badly to believe him. But you'd come, wouldn't you? I mean, we'll get married, won't we? First things first, Jack, she said. First, you've got to help the Talpots. Then we'll talk about the future. It took her another hour of gentle persuasion, and when he left at last, a little before noon, making his way to the square, she felt as though a load had been raised from her. Oh, struggling. Properly. You fusion. Yeah, we got a long ways to go. Long ways to go. Long ways to go. Long ways to go. So, on the journey to Portuguese Place, Susan expanded on what she had already told him. There was no money or food left to pay servants. so she had let them go, except for Mopedi. Her plan was to cut all the timber along the river and sell it in Kimberley. Jack was to be in charge of the operation on the farm, the felling itself, and she and Marie would take the wood into town in the wagon and the Scotch cart, which would be drawn by mules, not susceptible to cattle plague. She had already negotiated to buy the mules from Jordan, who had survived the epidemic better than either the Dalports or the Lessings, because at least half of his operation had been breeding horses and mules. "We'll only need you for a couple of weeks," she said. "If I can build up a little capital, I'll hire some Hottentots to do the cutting. Then in the spring, I'm going to plow the fields down by the river and put in maize and use the pump to irrigate it. With the money from the maize crop, I'll buy horses and some cattle and sheep. But I'll also have pigs. I'm going to have a mixed farm. I'm not going to be caught again." They were on Portuguese place land now, and Jack could see the occasional carcass lying near the road. There was a feeling of death in the air. In spite of his mood, which was one of resentment at somehow having been forced into doing what he was doing, he was conscious of the way she spoke, how she was going to do this and she was going to do that. She had told him that Franz was ill, and he wondered just how bad he was. As if divining his thoughts, she began to talk about her husband. "He's changed. Be prepared for it." She drove on in silence for a while, then said more to herself than to him, "He is like some nomadic chief. His wealth and stature are measured by the size of his flocks. Now that the flocks are gone, he has nothing. Always put some money in the bank, Jack. Don't have all your eggs in one basket." The river was away to their left, and Jack looked at the grey-green line of trees in the fading afternoon light. She followed his glance. "Yes, it's a pity, but they'll grow again. If we don't sell the wood, we'll lose the farm, and if we lose the farm, Franz will die." They came to the house, sprawling on its hillside. The last time Jack had been there, the cattle and the sheep kraals had been full. Now they were empty, their concertina gates lying in the dust. "Don't forget what I told you," Susan said. It was as well she had reminded him, for he was totally unprepared for what he saw. Franz was sitting in a chair near the fire. He was a shell of a man, shrunken and thin, his skin hanging on him in folds. His hair was white, and so was his beard, and his eyes seemed to have gone back into his skull. He was wrapped in a blanket, and Jack could see one thin, malted hand. "Here's Jack come to see you," Susan said. "Hello, Franz." Jack put out his hand. The hand on the blanket twitched, and Franz's mouth began to work. Slowly, a dribble of saliva ran down his chin. "He can hear perfectly well, but he can't speak yet," Susan said, taking a cloth and wiping his chin. "It won't be long, though. He's getting better every day, and the doctor says it's only a matter of time." Later that night, after they had eaten and Franz had been fed at the table like a child, Jack helped to put him to bed in one of the spare rooms. Susan stayed with him, and Jack was left alone with Marie. She had hardly said anything since his arrival. The boisterousness and the teasing had not surfaced at all. He had put this down to the shock of her father's illness and the natural result of the tragedy on the farm. She had thinned down, and her cheeks had become slightly hollow. "It's good of you to come," she said formally. "I was glad to." "Were you?" "Of course. I thought it might be interrupting something." She turned to the door. Good night. She understands about Lily, he thought. Early the following morning, in the bitter winter cold, he began the work of cutting down the river trees. It was a Herculean task, even though he was helped by Moperi part of the time. The tools they had were long handled axes and bow saws, and the trees were camel thorns and annas, wild figs, and willows. Although the trunks were not more than a foot or so in diameter, except for the willows, which were bigger, the wood was fibrous, tough, and springy, and the axes were not sharp. As each tree came down, it had to be cleaned of its small branches, then sawn into logs and loaded on the wagon and the Scotch cart. It was the same kind of brutal work he was used to on the diggings, but there he had Lily's company to look forward to. At Portuguese Place he worked alone or with Moperi. Susan and Marie were away most of the time, and Moperi's wife looked after Franz. Sometimes Jack would sit with him in the evenings, but mostly, dead tired, he would go to bed. He found that he missed Lily more than he could ever have imagined. Susan had said that he would only be needed for a few weeks, but she could not have foreseen what would happen. Spring came early, and the days were unseasonably hot. The result was that there was a sudden drop in the demand for firewood and prices plummeted. Instead of saving money, they were spending everything they made just to keep alive. At first, Jack seemed to make no impression on the trees, but one day, after he had been on the farm for a fortnight, he was helping to put Franz in the sun on the stoop and wrap him in his blanket when the old man, that is how Jack now thought of him, started to say something. His speech was returning, and so was some hand movement. One hand came up and his lips moved, and Jack thought he said, "Trees." Jack looked down to the river and for the first time saw the gaps he had created. As the days passed, the gaps grew and joined until after 6 weeks, the whole area in front of the house was devoid of trees and scarred by the wheels of the wagons. Franz no longer wished to be brought out onto the stoop and kept to his chair in the living room with his back to the windows. Susan realized they could not go on living from hand to mouth as they were. Things had to be done. Lands had to be plowed to plant maize. Stock had to be bought for fattening. In other words, the farm had to be started again. But where to get the money? The sale of the wood was barely paying their food and doctor's bills. She went into town to see the manager of the bank. She knew him slightly, for Marie had once had tea at his house. His name was Mitford, and he was a solemn, plump, middle-aged man. He had a habit of sorting through papers on his desk while he was talking as though they contained vital information about the subject under discussion. Now, as he spoke, he began to rummage among letters and documents. "Let me see, Mrs. Dalport. You wish the loan to restock the farm?" He lifted a batch of papers and looked at them. "Yes." Susan was sitting primly on the edge of a chair. "I was sorry to hear of your misfortune." The bank was sorry. "Thank you." "Your husband, Mrs. Dalport, as the bank understands, was in a substantial way of business, was he not? He was the biggest stock owner in the district. The farm can be put on its feet again. I know it can." "What about the disease?" "It's run its course. We keep a check on the antelope. We haven't found a dead one for months." "As I recall, Mr. Talbot did not use the facilities of the bank. He invested in the farm." "I see. He thought that was safer, did he?" "I don't know about being safer." Susan heard her voice stumbling. Mr. Mitford read the address on a letter and pushed it away. "Please, Don't think the bank is unsympathetic, Mrs. Talbot, but these are troubled times. Now, had you been clients of the bank, had we an association, then the circumstances might be different. But as you can appreciate, it is not the bank's money. She rose abruptly. I shall not trouble you further, Mr. Mudford. So, so good of you to come in. He shuffled his papers. And how is your dear daughter? But Susan left without answering. She stood out on the pavement, angry and confused. Where to next? She saw the sign Levinson's Emporium. She supposed, but no, she would not go to Mr. Levinson, even though he had offered to help, nor to David for that matter. She remembered what her father had often told her: never do business with friends, never borrow money from them, never lend money to them. What if what if they had changed their minds since their first offer? What if they even looked as though they might refuse her? That would be enough to ruin their relationship. She remembered the look on Jack's face when she had come to him for help. It had cut her to the heart. No, she would ask nothing of her friends. Who then? Well, there was always Mr. Bulchand. She knew of Bulchand, as did most people in Kimberley, but had never had any dealings with him. She had heard stories of people who had gone to him to borrow money and, because his rates of interest were so high, had never been able to pay off the capital. One man was said to have shot himself because of this. She told herself that such stories always clung to moneylenders, and she made her way to the outskirts of town, where he had his office. There were two views of Mr. Bulchin. Those who owed him money looked upon him with an anxiety often amounting to fear. Those who did not do business with him sometimes described him as a funny little coolie. Mr. Bulchin was neither funny nor a coolie. He was the illegitimate son of a Turkish father and an Armenian mother, who had grown up in the stews of Smyrna. He had come to Africa with a great sack of dried figs, had left the boat at Port Elizabeth, sold his figs, bought a cartload of pumpkins, sold the pumpkins, bought 30 boxes of cheap shoes just unloaded from Northampton, and had carried the shoes on his back until he sold them at a profit of nearly 400%. He reckoned to himself that if he could achieve this kind of profit, knowing only a dozen or so words of English, this was the country for him. He walked the hamlets of the Eastern Cape trading as a smalls, a peddler, and in a few years had made enough to set himself up in the commodity he knew best: money. When diamonds were found in Northwest, he was attracted as a bee to nectar. He knew little about diamonds and had no wish to learn, but he knew exactly how much a pound note was worth to a man who needed it badly enough. It was not possible simply to see Mr. Bulgin. Arrangements had to be made. And when Susan arrived at the small office, one of his sons, Nicky, went to make the arrangements. She sat in the corrugated iron room, bare of anything but a deal table and two chairs, and waited. 10 minutes later, Bulgin arrived. He was in his early 60s, small and dapper, dressed in a dove grey suit and waistcoat, grey spats, grey cravat. His hair was grey and brushed smoothly back over a high-domed head. His face was thin, and his head little tufts of hair growing from his ears. He bowed formally over Susan's hand and sat at the table. She noticed that his nails were beautifully kept. The only concession to the fact that he lived in a diamond town was a solitaire ring on the third finger of his right hand. The diamond glittered against his brown skin. He spoke to his son, who stood behind his chair. My father says, how can he help you? Um, I've come to ask about a loan. My father asks how much. She spoke to Mr. Bulgin, but the mouth that answered was Nicky's. He was a smooth, dark-visaged young man with oiled hair, but as soberly dressed as his father. Damn it! Come on! £1,000, she said. She had calculated that 8 or 900 would probably do, but had decided that the higher figure would give her some leeway. My father asks, "What's this for?" "Investing in stock." My father says, what is stock?" Sheep, cattle, pigs, farm animals." Bolton smiled, and Susan realized that he probably understood every word she said. My father says, "What farm is this?" "It is called Portuguese Place. My name is Dalport. Perhaps he has heard of the name." My father says he knows the name. He says, "Do you know what interest he's charging?" "No." 20%. We take at beginning. You borrow £1,000, we give you 800. You pay us back 1,000. You understand? 800, she thought. Could she do it on 800? But there was no question of could she. She had to. "All right," she said. "My father says he must see title deeds of farm. He says, tell your husband to bring them when he comes to sign papers. My husband is very ill. My father says when he better. He will never get better. I run the farm." Mr. Bulgin smiled and stood up. Then he said something to his son. "My father says he don't do no business with ladies. He never has and never will. My father says ladies do not have farms. This is work for men." Mr. Bulgin bowed. Susan opened her mouth and closed it with a snap. "Thank you, father," she said flatly and walked out into the street. During the following days, she fought to save the farm. She tried several other banks as well as the Kimberley Trust and Loan Co. But the fact that Rinderpest had struck the farm and that a woman was now trying to salvage it was too much of a risk. She was tempted several times to go to the Levinsons or even to David, who knew wealthy people, but each time she recalled the expression she had seen on Jack's face and drew back from the idea of asking help. So, she did what she could in other ways. She decided to sell some of their possessions. There was the furniture with which she had refurbished the hotel suite, and there was a great deal at Portuguese Place which she could manage without. She arranged for J.J. Rothschild, the auctioneer, to come out to the farm to collect the pieces. In preparation for that, she had given Franz a little laudanum to make him sleep so that he would not hear his possessions being removed. She had also sent Marie down to the river to fetch a load of wood so that she would be out of the way as well, not wanting to see the effect on Marie when she realized that things she had grown up with were being taken away. Her plans went somewhat awry. Awry. Franz slept peacefully enough, but Marie was quicker than she had expected, and Rothschild and his boys were only halfway through the job when she came up from the river with Jack. Susan watched them from the veranda. They stood below the house watching for a few moments, and then Marie ran to the bottom of the steps, her face alive with pleasure and excitement. "Are we moving?" she called. "Are we going to live in town?" When Susan told her what was happening, the change was dramatic. Her face became sullen, eyes bitter, and she backed away to stand with Jack again. For a moment, Susan felt anger in herself, but she controlled it. There was no reason why Marie should love Portuguese Place as she did, but why did she hate it? Or did she? Perhaps it was only her natural reaction to her parents and to the regrets of her life. What if she married and the place were hers? Would her attitude be different then? She looked at them, standing below the house. What if Jack were master here? Jack. She had never discussed the land deal she had first mentioned to persuade him to come out to the farm. She had thought of it many times, but each time something had stopped her from talking about it. It would break up the farm, and this was akin to breaking up her own self. Everything she was came from the land she stood on. Franz had fought to keep it. She would fight even though she saw no future. And Jack? She would pay Jack somehow, but in money, not in land. By the end of the day, the house was bare of anything except for the furniture that was necessary to continue civilized, if not comfortable, living. She watched Rothschild's wagons leave, expecting to feel a wrench at the sight of their possessions disappearing. But she felt nothing. Her mind was too full of Francis' illness and Marie's future, and what to do about Jack. Anyway, the most important things remained. The pieces of furniture Franz had made all those years before when they were starting their life on Portuguese Place. But her reaction was not the same when she saw them in Kimberley. She had not meant to attend the auction, but Franz needed one or two things. So she had left Marie and Jack to look after him. When she came through the square, the auction was already in progress. A crowd had collected around Rothschild's wagon. She made her way to the front and, with a shock, saw a mound of familiar articles. Old Cape Dutch chests, tall boys made from yellow wood, a wardrobe of stink wood, a military chest with brass-bound corners, inlaid tables, bookcases of mahogany, a four-poster bed. They were piled anyhow, dusty, almost abandoned. She did not see them as inanimate pieces of wood, but as things with a life of their own. She knew exactly where the tall boy had stood. The chest had been near the door, in which room the bed had been. Instead of a picture, they lay on its side in the dust. Her mind's eye now saw only a discolored patch on the drawing room wall. Something twisted inside her as though these things were being harmed, and she was feeling their pain. She told herself she was being silly. What did they amount to anyway? They were simply material possessions she could do without. She forced herself not to think about them and instead concentrated on the bidding. And soon her thoughts vanished, replaced by a feeling of astonishment. A chair which had stood for years in one of the spare rooms, for which she had paid half a crown at one of Rothschild's auctions, was being knocked down for 5 guineas. She thought she had misheard. A tall boy fetched 100. She had paid 30. A bolt of curtain material, bought but never used, was sold for nearly twice what could be bought for new. Could these be her possessions? An old desk made of deal which Franz had used in his office, and which she had once thought of as firewood, was started at 10 guineas. Immediately the bidding leaped up to 15, to 20, and finished at 22. She looked around to see who was bidding. For a moment she thought Joe Malone had nodded his head, but that could not be. The next item was an old rocker which she had replaced years before, and which squeaked badly. She watched it being sold for 8 guineas. This time she was sure Malone had bid. It was followed by a hanging lamp which she had bought in Cape Town. It went for 3 guineas, about twice its value, to a bidder on the far side of the crowd. She was sure it was Dan Halkett. Everything went at inflated and sometimes ridiculously high prices. She could not understand it. She would have heard if Joe or Dan had suddenly struck it rich, and then towards the end of the sale she saw something occur which gave her a clue. A table had come up, and the bidding had been less brisk than before. She was watching Malone. He had turned away and was looking towards the door of Levinson's Emporium. She thought she could make out a figure in the doorway. Just then he stepped forward, and she saw that it was Mr. Levinson himself. He raised his finger in a signal to Malone. Joe nodded and turned back to Bert. Susan walked away and found herself, without knowing how she had got there, in Madame Delatte's with a pot of tea in front of her. A storm of conflicting emotions raged in her mind: shame, gratitude, humiliation. At first, the thought of Charity made her feel physically ill, but slowly she realized that there was no way she could make Mr. Leveson take his money back without causing a rift between them. In any case, how was she to tell which pieces he had bought and which had been bought by others? She brooded about her position for several days before deciding that there was nothing she could do to change things. Not at the moment, anyway. Except be grateful and use the money to save Portuguese planes. So she bought a plough and 6 bullocks, and soon her garden was torn down, and long furrows cut the flat land down near the river as maize lands were created. The rains came early that season, and prospects for the crop looked good. Jack had been on the farm for over 2 months when one of the wagons broke a wheel near Kimberley. and had to be mended. He took the opportunity to go and see Lily. It was a Sunday evening, and he arrived at the shack about 7 o'clock. She was not there, so he went to the Grand. But there was no performance that night, and it was in darkness. He wondered if she was giving a recital at a private house or a party. There was one man who would certainly know. He went to Aaron's house. He heard a voice even before he reached the door. It was one of what he thought of as a serious songs, and he could hear the tinkle of a piano accompaniment. He knocked, but there was no reply, and he let himself in. A voice was coming from the music room. As he went up the passage, the song came to an end, and he heard clapping. The door was slightly ajar, and he could see into the room. It was full of people and was very hot. The night was close, and occasionally there was a rumble of thunder. Lily was at the far end with Aaron. He could see David, his face red above his starched white collar, with Hilda Levinson on his arm. Damn it. He did not know the names of the others, but had seen many of them before. They were the culturals. Lily was wearing her red dress with the black silk shawl and looked more beautiful than he had ever seen her. Her face was alive with pleasure and excitement, and he felt a sudden pang. She never looked like that in his company. The clapping continued for almost a minute. He saw that everyone held a glass of champagne. As the clapping came to an end, Arendt put his hand up and said, "Now, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the real reason for being here." He took a long white envelope from his inside pocket. "You all know what this is, so I will not talk too much. I only say this, that it comes to dear Lily from every member of the Kimberley and District Music Society with all our best wishes for good fortune." Jack listened, puzzled. It was clearly some kind of presentation, and he wondered if it was her birthday. Then Lily saw him, and her eyes widened, widened, widened. She tried to smile, but it was tentative, and a sudden shadow crossed her face. Aaron finished what he was saying, and then a woman began to speak. She was thin, elderly, and wore a dress with much gray lace on it. Jack had seen her before and knew she was a leading light in the music society. "And our greatest thanks," she said, "are for Herr Arendt, who has put up 2/3 of the money himself. Miss Bartlett could not have had a finer teacher. I think we all agree that he could have brought her to the highest standards himself. It is a mark of his modesty that he feels she could continue her training in London, and a mark of his generosity that he has made so handsome a contribution towards that end. When Miss Bartlett is a famous diva singing in Rome and Paris, she will have Herr Arendt to thank for it. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you first of all our Lily, who, we know, will reach the greatest heights, but who, we hope, will not forget her friends of the Kimberley and District Music Society. But I also give you Peter Arendt, who discovered her and to whom we all are so grateful." Again there was a burst of clapping, and someone shouted, "Come on, Lily, speech!" Another called, "Never mind the speech, give us a song." In the silence, Lily said, "I can't make speeches, but all I can say is thank you, from the very bottom of my heart." She was looking everywhere except at Jack. The clapping continued as he began to push his way through the crowd. His face was like granite. She watched him come towards her, shouldering people aside. He was still several yards from her when there was a commotion to his left, and a thud. He heard a voice say, Make way! Give him air, someone said. It's the heat. Loosen his collar. Jack turned and saw that David had fainted. Errant bustled forward, his white, perspiring face past Jack without greeting. People hurriedly left the room, opening the door to the street to let air in. The night sky was slashed by lightning. David was lifted and carried outside, and in a few seconds, Jack and Lily were alone in the room. Neither moved. Jack looked at the envelope in her hand. Is it true? He asked. Are you really going to London? Yes, Jack. Is there money in that envelope? A check, Jack. It's all been so sudden. I wanted to tell you, but you weren't there. You weren't here. Don't you see? It's the one chance I've got. She put her hand on his arm. My dear, I tried to warn you not to become too involved. I tried not to encourage you to plan for our future, but you always would. Don't you see, Jack? It would never have worked. Is that how you treated Lothar too? The poor bastard. She flinched. Then she said quietly, My life is my own business, Jack. But I'll tell you this much. Lothar was a good man once, kind and simple and loving. Don't talk soft. For God's sake, try to understand. There's one thing I understand. Only whores take money from men. Oh boy, it's getting dark in here. Oh my goodness. So many pages. So many pages. So many pages. So many pages. Ooh, 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 Walk it off, champ. Walk it off, walk it off. Oh. David lay against the pillows, watching rain lash down on the window pane. He was in the Levinsons' spare bedroom, where he had been for nearly a fortnight since collapsing at Aaron's house. He had no recollection of the first week when he had been delirious with fever. It was well past noon, and any time now Mrs. Levinson would arrive with a tray. He was not hungry, and the thought of food bored him. The rain bored him too. It had been raining on and off for days, one storm following another, clouds so black as to make daytime seem like dusk. On the table next to the bed was a pile of books. A copy of Goldsmith's She Stoops to Conquer lay open on his chest. Such intelligence, Miss Levinson had said when he had given her a list of books he would like to read. Such taste. But he had hardly looked at them. Dr. Hibbert had warned him that he would feel weary and depressed most of the time during his convalescence, for it always followed a bout of camp fever. Convalescence. Convalescence. There was a soft knock at the door. Come in. Mrs. Levinson entered, carrying a tray, and was followed by her husband. We thought you might be asleep, she said. If anything, she was stouter than when David had first met her, and her flesh still shook as she walked. Chicken soup, a real broth to put flesh on those bones again. He had lost nearly 10 pounds. His hair, which usually sat on his skull like a smooth dark cap, had grown during his illness and made his face seem thinner. His skin was a sickly white. The smell of food made him feel queasy, but he knew he would have to eat it, for Mrs. Levinson became hurt if her cooking was rejected. How are you today, my boy? Mr. Levinson said. Better. That's the spirit. We'll soon have you up and about. Such talk, Mrs. Levinson said. Look at the poor boy. Poor boy. Look at the poor boy. He can hardly lift the spoon, and you talk up and about. He'll stay in this bed until Dr. Hilbert says he's ready. Eat it while it's hot. They stood watching him. They did this at almost every meal, willing the food down his throat, tasting as he tasted, enjoying the flavor with him, being him. Good boy, she said as he finished the soup. Now, a little fruit. No thanks, What about some cheesecake? I made it myself. Just then, Hilda came in to shoo them out. You stand and stare at him while he eats. What is he? Some sort of python? That's not the way to get him well. David watched the two older Levinsons move out of the room under her stern eyes. It was a measure of how much she and they had changed that it seemed more and more that it was Hilda who ran the family now. Her father had never really recovered from his jaundice attack. He seemed much older than when David had arrived in Kimberley. Then he had where was I? Where was I? It was a measure of how much she and they had changed that it seemed more and more that it was Hilda who ran the family now. Her father had never really recovered from his jaundice attack. He seemed much older than when David had arrived in Kimberley. Then he had been plump and energetic. Now he was often tired. She smiled and shook her head in a kind of mock exasperation. Always fussing, she said. I don't know what they'll do when they don't have anyone to fuss over. She began to plump up his pillows and straighten his sheets, which she did 3 or 4 times a day. She was an attractive woman, he thought, as she bent over him, attractive and capable. He caught the smell of lavender and remembered the hot afternoon when he had put his hand inside her bowled eyes. For the past 2 months, they had been seeing each other more frequently, and had taken up almost where they had left off when von Holzmann had entered the picture. Von Holzmann, one day he had been there and the next he was gone. When David had asked Hilda where he was, her lips had formed a thin line and she had said, "How should I know?" She never spoke of him, nor did her parents. It was as though he had never existed. But for quite a long time David had seen the anger in her eyes. Perhaps that was when she had grown up. Their renewed friendship had meant a lot to him, for his own life was barren. They had gone out together to hear Lily sing at several private recitals and also to the Lennian Theatre. He had seen the glow on her parents' faces as they watched the friendship progress. Now here she was looking after him better than he had ever been looked after in his life. He watched as she went around the room, straightening and tidying, organized, deft, and at the same time almost pretty. Are you ready? She said. She passed him a dressing gown and turned her back while he put it on. He swung his feet to the edge of the bed and she put her hand under his arm. How do you feel? Wobbly. She walked him up and down the room for nearly 10 minutes. They had been doing this for the past 3 days. He liked to feel her hands on him and smell her smell and be close to her, and she seemed to like being close to him. May I sit in the chair? All right. She tucked a blanket around him. Would you like a cigar? Won't you mind the smell? I love it when you smoke. He drew on the cigar and she sat opposite him, and they watched the rain on the windows. Have you thought what you were going to do? She said. He knew what she meant. No one pretended anymore. They knew, and he knew, that a period of his life was ending. The thought of going back to the claim by himself, of the endless work, of the lonely nights in the tent, made him even more depressed. And then she said in a softer voice, I know what you're feeling. You're thinking it would be giving up, but it wouldn't. You've worked harder than anyone. You have struggled and fought. No one could have worked harder. She was saying what he was to hear. He knew that the Levinsons needed him, and he knew why. Mrs. Levinson was fearful of her husband's health. She wanted him to live in the Cape, and she saw David the means of achieving this. Mr. Levinson himself wanted to go, and he saw in David the means of his own release. And Hilda? He assumed that she saw what she had always seen in him, a husband and a partner in the store. He knew he was in a kind of spidery web, but he also knew that it contained comfort, security, and love, things he had almost forgotten existed. But at the center of the web was the store. Would he really want to serve behind a counter for the rest of his days? He put out a hand and gripped one of Hilda's. There was answering pressure. You've been so good to me, he said. She colored and seemed to wait for him to go on, but he withdrew his hand and said, Would you read to me? Get out of my face. Get out of my face. Get out my face. Boy, 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 boy. Bum 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 bum. Ay, 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 ay. Patam, pam patam, pam patam patam pam pam patam, pam patam, patam 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 pam. Cotton braiding, David said. Cotton braiding. The customer was a large lady in black bombazine, bombazine, bombazine. Oh, bombazine. Off white. Cotton braiding off white. He repeated it, as if it were some magic incantation. One moment, please. Hilda was serving another customer further along the counter. Cotton braiding, David whispered, in the haberdashery drawers. The top one. He hurried back. The woman was looking impatient. You must be new here, she said. Yes, I'm helping out. He opened the top haberdashery drawer and saw rolls of different colored woven cotton, which he assumed was braiding. He picked up one and showed it to her. That's beige, she said. Don't you have off white? It seems that's all we have. Give me 2 yards then. He measured 2 yards against the brass rule set into the countertop, cut it off with dressmaking shears, placed it in a small box, wrapped it up in brown paper, and tied it with string. That'll be 9 pence, he said. She paid and left. He turned to put the braiding away. As he did so, a voice said, Half a pound of iron fillings, please. He turned and saw Peter Errand. So, they've got you at last, Errand said, softly enough so that neither Hilda nor her mother, in her usual place on the high stool, could hear. David smiled. The old man wasn't feeling too good this morning. Anyway, I need something to do. That room's driving me mad. What you really need is a glass of beer. He turned to Hilda and Mrs. Levinson. Does anyone mind if I steal David for a little while? They went to one of the cozies. The day was close and sticky, with thunder on the horizon, and David was thirsty. "Where do you think Lily is?" he said when they were settled. "It depends on how long she had to wait for a ship. She could be half a way to England." "Do you really think she is that good?" I I would not be wasting my time if I did not. I wrote to Mantelli 2 months ago telling him about her. I said he would be lucky to get her. Who's Mantelli? The best voice teacher in London. But I do not think she will need him for long. I, too, am going to Europe in a few months. Did you know? I must go to Berlin to see my father and to Amsterdam to see Ashes about cutting some stones. So I also go and see how Lily is getting on. He paused. "What are you going to do?" David shrugged. "Everyone's asking me that. The Levinsons are always watching me as though they're trying to read my mind. They need you. It's hard to decide what to do." "It seems simple to me," Aaron said. You've you've been digging in the ground for more than 3 years. You have found nothing worthwhile. You only keep going by miracles." He held up his hand. "All right. I know you always wish to do it, but there comes a time when you must rationalize your position." "You sound like Mr. Levinson, a good Yiddish father. Listen, unless you have great luck, what you are doing is hopeless. It is like swimming in the sea with your eyes closed, trying to catch fish with your hands. Lots of people find good stones. Do you know anyone who has found a really good stone?" "Not personally, but you see? Understand something. You are working for a chance. Now I work for certainty. You say some people find good stones. I say whoever finds a good stone must come to a diamond buyer. And there are very few buyers compared to diggers. You should be a buyer. You need money for that. Anyway, I don't think I know enough about diamonds. I could teach you." "I thought you hated them, that they bored you." "They are a means to an end. I wish to make a fortune quickly so that I can do what I like. But I am here to represent my father. I have been wanting to talk to you about this for a long time, but you were always mule-headed about digging. Talk. I want to form a partnership to make my own money." David's eyebrows shot up. "With me? Why not? You could combine your work in the shop with buying and selling diamonds. It would give you a good base." The idea was so overwhelming it took David's breath away. He had long ago realized that digging for diamonds was not what he wanted at all. The gems themselves obsessed him. How they were discovered did not. "Don't say anything now," Peter said. "Think about it." Then he added, "How are you and Hilda?" "Fine." David's thoughts were far away. "Does she ever mention von Hausmann?" "No. What happened to him?" "There's been a gold strike in the Eastern Transvaal. He went there. He left suddenly." "Was she upset?" "I didn't ask her." "Did you want to marry him?" "I don't think he had come to that." "He said he told her he could never marry her because she was a Jewess and his family would not permit it." "He told you that?" David felt a sudden surge of anger. "Surely something like that doesn't still upset you." "I wasn't thinking of myself. Imagine how Hilda must have felt." They parted, and David went back to the store. As his initial anger cooled, so his concern for Hilda increased. He felt a sympathy for her that was new to him. During the next few days, he made his decision. It did not spring from any dramatic incident, but it was rather the culmination of a desire to be rid forever of the merciless work of digging. In a short while, he found himself, to his astonishment, a partner in 3 enterprises. He still shared ownership of the New Chance claim with Jack, but he was also a junior partner in Levison's Emporium and a full partner in Aaron and Kate Diamond Merchants. This was a somewhat grandiose title for what he actually was, a Kopje Walloper, a man who walked the diggings with a leather satchel containing money, a loop, and a small pair of scales, and whose job it was to try and smell out recent discoveries and talk the diggers into selling their stones to him, thus freeing them from the long, hot walk into town where the better known diamond merchants had their offices. This was the way of learning his trade, so to speak. Later, with any luck, he would be a merchant with an office of his own. But before he signed the partnership papers, he went out to see Jack, for his new interests meant that he would not be working the claim. Mr. Levinson had gone to Portuguese Place a few weeks earlier on some pretext, taking with him a basket of fruit for Franz and some coffee and bacon as presents to Susan. And he had told David that things were bad, but even that had not prepared him for the reality. The last time he had been there, cattle and sheep had dotted the scrub desert as far as the eye could see. Now the place was derelict. As he drove, as he drove his hired trap through the main gate, he noticed that the name board hung askew, and that some of the fencing poles were broken and the wire was sagging. He could see the occasional pile of bones, which was all that marked the rinderpest epidemic. Somehow, he had expected at least some outward sign that the money from the auction had been put to use. That had been his idea, and it was one that had worked splendidly. Several times he had sat with the Levinsons while they discussed ways and means of giving Susan a helping hand, but each time the ideas had come to nothing. She'd know its use, Mr. Levinson had said. She is too proud to take the money. I tried. I know. And then they had heard about the auction, and David had come up with the idea of allowing Malone and Dan Halkett to bid on their behalf. What a brain! Mr. Levinson had said, patting him on the cheek in delight. I tell you, the boy's a genius. But Hilda had begun and then stopped. They had looked at her. Nothing, nothing. David had organized Malone and Halkett, and even put in some of his own money. At first, Mr. Levinson had demurred. Listen, this is my business. They set me up in the early days. If it wasn't for them, there would be no Levinson's Emporium. It's my idea, David had said. Anyway, maybe I could use some good furniture. Who knows? I might need one. I might need one day. And so they had worked it, and Susan had no idea. That was the best part of it, but had it been too late? The house stood in a kind of wilderness, a man-made wilderness. The view from the stoop, which even to his sooty eyes had been the most beautiful aspect of Portuguese Place, was now a vista in ruins. Bare tree stumps stuck from the ground, interspersed with blackened areas where the light brush had been burnt. The entire area had been scarred and churned up by the wagon wheels. The trees had simply vanished, and the river no longer looked like a real river, but more like a donga, as they called the dry water courses scoured by erosion. In the distance he could make out a wagon and a Scotch cart coming slowly towards him. At first he thought that the drivers must be two hired Hottentots, for they were dressed in men's clothing and wearing battered, sweat-stained hats. But when he drew up with them, he found Susan was driving the mule wagon and Marie the Scotch cart. Susan had lost weight and looked like a piece of stringy beef that had been cured in the sun. Marie's complexion had darkened, and for the first time he wondered whether Mr. Levinson's remark, which he had dismissed out of hand when first hearing it, was true. Could there be some blood in her that was not white? They pretended, the three of them, that his call was social and that each was about his normal business. It was a pretense which could not hide the obvious truth, for David realized that what he was looking at were poor whites, a phrase he had only heard since coming to Africa. The crop looks good, he said, pointing to the half-grown maize that covered an area below the house. We have had plenty of rain this year, almost too much, Susan said. They chatted for some moments while Marie looked on stonily, and then Susan said, "If you're looking for Jack, he's about 2 miles downstream." David thanked her and drove on down the precarious track. He found Jack by following the noise of the axe in a thicket of acacia trees. He was stripped to the waist, and his pale body was covered in dust. David had had the foresight to pack a basket with half a dozen bottles of beer. Jack wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and drank steadily until one of the bottles was emptied. He looked like a scarecrow. His trousers were torn and his boots cut, and David felt self-conscious in his new cotton suit with the new white Panama on his head. Jack propped the axe against a tree, went down to the river and scooped water over his head and shoulders. It was a burning day. As he came back, he said, "You haven't come all this way to bring me a bottle of beer." "That's not a welcome, Jack. Yeah, I came to see how you were, and look at me. And you'll know, yes, things have been hard, I can see that. But you've done a good job." His eyes took in the devastated landscape. "Without you, Portuguese Place would have been finished." Jack did not reply, but drank from another bottle which David had offered him. The dry tissues of his body soaked it up like blotting paper, and immediately sweat broke out on his face and chest, and evaporating cooled him. "I never thought you'd stick it out," David said, smiling. "You must be a farmer at heart. Me? I'm a townsman." Jack stared over the top of the bottle at the harsh hills above the river. Why had he stayed? It was a question he asked himself regularly. He hated the work. There was tension between himself and Marie. There was old Franz living like an elderly infant in the decaying house. There was Susan working herself to the bone. No one could say it had been fun, but each time he thought of going back to Kimberley, something inside him quailed. It was still bitter about the way Lily had treated him. He sensed now that she had never meant their relationship to be permanent, and that she had seen Susan's need for him as a way of preparing the ground for breaking it up. It was the first time he had ever revealed himself to a woman, and had nearly been destroyed by the experience. He would never do so again. He was learning all the time. First, there had been David. He had thought he was still his friend, but that had gone bad. Now Lily. But the most important factor in Jack's remaining on the farm was part of the central core of his character. It was the fear of humiliation. He had gone from nothing at the diggings to being someone. He had knocked out Lothar. He had become the town's boxing wonder, and his reward, as he saw it, had been Lily. But now he no longer boxed at the Grand, and Lily had left him. He had come crashing down again and was back where he had started. Knowing man as he did, he could see in his mind's eye the smiles behind the hands, the stifled sniggers, the knowing looks, stifled. The farm had been a kind of haven in spite of the fact that Susan had never mentioned the land deal again. Well, when he had finished the trees, he had confronted her. Who knows? There might be diamonds on Portuguese Place after all. Franz had said he had had the place surveyed, and that none had been found. But Franz had not wanted any found. Perhaps it had never been properly surveyed. Why shouldn't there be diamonds? David and Jack sat down near the river and drank beer and talked. Or rather, David did the talking mainly about Kimberly and the Levinsons. Gradually, he led the conversation into his own change of interest. Jack seemed to accept that after his illness, David could not work as he had before, and so David pressed on and told him what he was planning. "What happens to the claim while you go off with your friends?" Jack said. "That's what I've come about. If you're thinking of selling, forget it. I'll never sell. Never. I know that. And I've thought of a way. I've talked to Joe Malone and Dan Halkett. The claim's bottomed out in Blue Ground. It's hopeless to go on, and they can't afford to buy a new one. Joe's been talking about moving on to the Transvaal to look for gold, but they can't afford that either. We could let them work the claim and take a share in anything they find. I trust Dan with my life." I don't like it much," Jack said. "There's no other way, if you want to keep the claim." Jack recognized the truth in that. In a way, he wasn't ready to return to Kimberley yet. The thought of owning a piece of land, any piece, had begun to appeal to him. Land was hard to come by. If he went back to Kimberley now, he would have nothing. But if he went back as the owner of a bit of land, he picked up the axe and swung it at the base of a tree, using his big bony body like a machine. "Do it your way," he said. That was how it was arranged. Malone and Halkett took over New Chance, and David began his new life. From an existence in which he had concentrated solely on filling buckets with spoil and then looking through the spoil for tiny chips of crystallized carbon, he widened his experience dramatically. Mr. Levinson had been so grateful for his acquiescence that he put nothing in the way of a separate partnership with Errand. Even Hilda, from whom he thought might meet some resistance, foresaw it as a way for him to gain a wider acceptance in Kimberley and become what Errand had become, a respected Jewish magnate moving in the best cultural circles, something her father, for all the size of his business, had never become. So David split his day in two. In the morning, he learned how to become a merchant. At first, Levinson gave him the benefit of his experience, but he and his wife spent much of their time talking about the Cape and planning the house they would have. And when they would leave, it was Hilda who took over David's education. He had been clever at school and had worked in a bank so that the bookkeeping at Levinson's was child's play. But that was not the important side of the business. To get those books to show a profit, he had to sell the goods in the shop. Until then, he had not considered this angle. His impression had been that people simply came in and bought. He learned what to stock and what not to stock. He learned now to buy large consignments of goods cheaply and to undercut his competitors by a few pence per item. He learned when to have sales and when not to have sales. That when the diamond market was down, he would have to sell cheaply, and when it was up, to mark the prices accordingly. He learned where the best coffee came from, how to tell good boer tobacco from bad, to buy only enough perishable goods, not to have them go bad on him, but whom to sell them to if they did. He learned what a bill of lading was and how to write letters which began, "Dear sirs, in answer to your letter of the 5th inst." He learned that white people did not like to be kept waiting while he served blacks, that it was good policy to give children a handful of free boiled sweets and a pat on the head when they were accompanied by their parents. And he also learned the maxim which Levinson constantly repeated: "You can't go broke making a profit." Much of what he did he found distasteful, but what astonished him was the amount of money taken over the counters of the shop. It came in a silver and copper stream, in significant amounts, tuppences and pennies and even halfpennies, all adding up to make a bank balance that he realized must be one of the most respectable of any merchant in town. He also met his rivals and the middleman, and soon he was wearing the expression of a prosperous Burgess. Burgess? There was only one thing wrong. He hated the shop. It bored him and took away his self respect. So, as he served a pound of sugar or a cotton vest or 6 inches of chewing tobacco to a black man who smelled like the inside of a cold fireplace, he would look forward to the afternoon when the other half of his life began. Oh. Taking forever. Only you can set me free. Arendt worked from a wooden shack near Stockdale Street. It had a brass plaque on the wall near the door which stated simply, Arendt and Mayer, Diamond Merchants, Berlin, Kimberley. Within a week of the setting up of the partnership, another brass plate was put up, reading, Arendt and Kate, Diamond Merchants. It looked very new and shiny the first time David saw it, and he put out his finger and traced the lettering of his name. Just seeing it there gave him more pleasure than all the money that poured over the counter at Levinson's, and all the stones he and Jack had found. But it seemed to lack the romance of the words Berlin, Kimberley. One day he thought it might read London, Kimberley. The inside of the shack was simple. It consisted of a desk, three or four plain chairs, a small pair of balances, and a safe in one corner. At a table with a green base cloth was set under the window. You must have a north light to see the stones at their best, Peter said. David started his education by being present when Aaron made his deals. When there was no one else in the shack, Aaron would take him through the history and the economic theory of diamonds. The first thing he realized was that the diggers seemed to know very little about their own business. He had listened to 100 experts in the canteens and cozies, but when confronted by a real expert, their knowledge of the product was sketchy. A man would come in with a stone which he thought was valuable, and Peter would weigh it on his balance and examine it by the light of the window. Sometimes he would even take the stone into the street to examine it more closely. All the time, the digger would be telling him what a wonderful stone it was. Then Peter would pass the loop to the digger and say, "You have a look. See the flaw?" And it would be a carbon spot or a bubble or a cloud, a mass of infinitesimal, what am I saying it right now? Infinitesimal bubbles too small to be seen individually, but which gave the stone a cloudy appearance. The man would either deny it and take the stone elsewhere, or else nod hopelessly and say, "What'll you give me for it then?" But when a digger brought in a really good stone, Peter would bargain until he finally got it. One day a man produced a stone of about 30 carats. It was a beautiful diamond, and the digger wanted 3,000 pounds for it. Aaron looked at it carefully and then shook his head. "I'll give you 2,500. The digger stuck to his price, and Aaron suddenly gave in. "All right, 3,000. He went to his safe in the corner of the room, counted out the notes, and handed them to the man. "Why didn't you bargain?" David said after the digger had left. "You know who he is?" "No." "He's a German named Lab. He and his three brothers work two good claims. They take out excellent stones. He's never been to me before, but I've offered him more than he has been offered elsewhere." "How do you know?" Damn it. Sorry about that. The stone isn't worth more than 2.6 to 7. I doubt he's been offered to 5. The next time he gets a decent stone, he'll come to me. So will his brothers. You've got to know what's going on. Who are the good workers? Who are the drinkers? Who have the good claims? Who are the bad? Most of all, you've got to treat them right. In this business, everything is by reputation. There are no written contracts. A man's word is everything. Break your word once, and you've finished. There were long periods when no one came to the office. During these times, David learned about other aspects of the business. He had thought he knew a reasonable amount about diamonds from his reading and from the information he had picked up on the diggings, but it was only now that he realized how superficial his knowledge was. One afternoon, while he ate lunch at his desk, Peter began to talk about the birth of a diamond. "All diamonds come from the Earth's mantle," he said. "Do you know what that is?" David shook his head. Peter reached into the basket containing his lunch and took out a hard boiled egg. Without peeling it, he cut it in half and held up one piece. With the tip of his knife, he pointed to the shell. "You could call that the crust of the Earth," he said. "It is 20 miles thick and it's composed of rock." The knife moved to the white. "You can call the white the mantle. It is 1800 miles thick and also made of rock. He touched the yellow yolk. The core has a radius of more than 200 miles and is molten iron. It is in this part, he prodded the white, in the mantle that there are huge reservoirs of molten rock, and it is thought that diamonds were formed here out of carbon millions of years ago. Then pressure in the mantle forced the molten rock out to the surface of the earth in fissures. We call these fissures pipes. One of the pipes came to the surface here in Kimberley. He described how the liquid rock in the pipes had cooled and solidified, and how over the ages wind, rain, frost, and heat had broken it down into gravel. Yellow near the surface where oxygen reached it, blue farther down. The diamonds were found in the yellow ground. In the years to come, whenever David was describing to others how diamonds were formed, he always thought of the hard-boiled egg. On another occasion, Peter took from his waistcoat pocket a silver snuff box and emptied onto his desk some small brown beans. "Do you know what those are?" he said. "Some kind of seed?" "From the carob tree, which grows in the east. Look at them. Can you see anything different about them?" "No, they all look the same to me." Peter laughed. "You are right. They are the same. In olden times, the pearl merchants in the East found that when the seeds were dried, each one was almost exactly the same weight as the other, so they used them as measures of weight. You learned Greek at school. And Latin. In Greek, the word for the carob tree is caration, so we get our word carrot from it. Of course, we have standardized it since then. A carat is a fifth of a gram, and there are 142 carats in an ounce. But the most important thing for you is that if a stone is flawless, the heavier it is, the more expensive it is. Each carat becomes more expensive. You have seen me buy small stones for £1 a carat. They are nothing. But you saw the man who had the 30-carat stone. I paid him £100 a carat. Often he would talk about the history of diamonds, the mines in Golconda, India, and in Brazil. As he listened, David was again taken aback in time to the security of the big armchair in his grandparents' home, the steaming hot chocolate, and his grandfather's stories. He had been learning his trade for 3 weeks when he arrived one afternoon to find Peter looking at several articles on his desk. There was a leather satchel, a small pocket balance, and a loop. "It's time Aaron and Kate began to make some money," he said. "All I do here is make money for my father." Between them, they had put up £100 capital, and now he went to his safe, took out £51 notes, and stuffed them into the satchel. David's spell as a Kopje walloper was beginning. He knew about the subculture in the diamond economy, for he had been importuned many times by the Kopje wallopers to sell diamonds. He had always refused, never trusting them to give him the best price. Now, as he trudged through the close heat of the afternoon, he found himself on the other side of the fence. Being a Jew might have made things difficult for him. The profession was largely dominated by Jews from Whitechapel. He knew that the millionaire Barney Panetto, for instance, had been a Kopje walloper, many of whom had no money at all and lived on their woods. on their woods. But David had one priceless advantage in his relationship with the diggers. He had been one of them. Not only that, but he was a partner of Jack Farson, the man who had fought the greatest fight Kimberley had ever seen. The idea behind his work as a Kopje developer was to drum up trade for the newly formed partnership. Established customers dealt with Peter in his capacity as representative of Arendt and mayor of Berlin. But new customers, those discovered by David, would be legitimately clients of Arendt and Kate of Kimberley. David had no desire to be a Kopje developer for very long, but he knew that until he had built up his contacts, he would be bringing nothing to the partnership. Slowly, his reputation as an honest man spread. He followed Aaron's precepts. At first, he made many mistakes. He missed carbon spots and other flaws. Sometimes he paid too much, sometimes he missed a good stone by offering too little. But he tried constantly to expand his clientele and would stop and talk to diggers he had not met before. He did this one afternoon, introducing himself to a man called Richie, an Australian. It was late in the afternoon and David was tired. He asked Richie if he had had any luck. The Australian was a tall, mournful looking man and was seated in his sorting table, listlessly inspecting a pile of gravel. He shook his head, and even that seemed to be an effort. David wondered if he was in that post fever state of depression which had so recently afflicted him. It's going to rain again, he said, to make conversation. Too true, Richie said. Some of the claims are waterlogged. You been here long? 8 months. Found anything decent? No. He wore an air of utter dejection. I ain't found nothing for nearly a month. He was starting to sweep the tailings onto a pile next to the table when David's eye was caught by something. Stop, he said. What's up? Look, he pointed at a stone that glinted. Christ! Richie picked it up with a pair of tweezers. Jesus, I almost missed it. Thanks a lot, mate. Can be. Should give me a few bob for that. He named a diamond buyer in the town. Wait, David said. At least give me a chance to make an offer. Oh, that seems fair enough. You spotted it. David picked up the stone and examined it. Then he waited. Then he examined it again. His hands began to shake. It was a beautiful diamond, by far the biggest and the purest he had encountered in his role as a buyer. He calculated what money he had in his satchel and then said, 200. The man looked crestfallen. I could get 3 in town. David felt a surge of power, an absolute conviction that the man would not go into town, that the diamond was his. Okay. 250, he said. Take it or leave it. The man shrugged. I'll take it. David counted out the notes and took the stone. Don't forget, he said. When you've got something to sell, come to me. The name's Cade. Later, when he reached the office, Peter spread the afternoon small haul of diamonds on the baize cloth, then separated Richie's. Where did you get this? From a new contact, an Australian. It's a beauty, isn't it? How much did you pay? 250. Yeah, it's worth at least 3. Peter put his hand into his waistcoat pocket, took out a diamond and placed it on the table. My God, David said, and again he felt his body tremble. Have a good look at it. The stone was cut and polished. Light was reflected from one plane to the other. What do you see? His grandfather had asked, and he had said, fire and ice. He had never seen a stone as good. He was overwhelmed. How much do you reckon it's worth? Aaron asked. Thousands, maybe 10,000s, or maybe 10 pounds. It's quartz, just like the one you bought from the Australian. David stared at him in horror. Quartz? Don't worry, it happens to everyone. But I know quartz. It depends how you look at it. You wanted that stone, didn't you? David nodded. You would have gone higher. He nodded again. You wanted it so badly, it became a diamond. Let me tell you something, David. Don't fall in love with these things. Don't desire a diamond for itself, or it will destroy you. They're pieces of crystallized carbon. That's all. You buy them and sell them, like anything else. That is your role. As time passed, it was clear that David was becoming someone in the town. Kimberley at that period was a raffish place with a constantly changing population. Everything depended on diamond money, and the people who came to dig for the diamonds seldom stayed for long. But the town had to be run. There had to be some kind of firm base, and this was formed by merchants and traders who had built up their businesses and who lived in proper houses and gave the place what little air of solidity it had. A clab, a club was being built. A library was planned. There was even talk of a town hall. When a vacancy on the town council occurred, an approach was made to David by a delegation of Jewish businessmen. It was led by one of the partners in Mulwutsky and Rosenberg, a rival store to Levinson's Emporium. Mr. Rosenberg talked to David in the Levinsons' living room. Mrs. Levinson, overwhelmed, bustled about, shouting at the servants to serve tea, and her husband peered through the door that led from the shop. Not quite part of the meeting, yet not quite a part either. Rosenberg was a small man who wore a natty grey suit with a double-breasted waistcoat and a chain over his plump little belly. He was bald, with a fringe of grey hair and liver spots on the top of his skull. What we're saying to you is this, Mr. Cade, he said. We, the Jewish community, wish to be represented on the town council. One day, we want to build a proper synagogue, and for this one must have power, for there will be strong opposition. In places where we have no representation, we always end up in ghettos. Do you know what a ghetto is, Mr. Cade? Yes, David said, remembering his childhood. I know what a ghetto is. I see it has come up, and it is in our power to fill it. What do you say? Why me? Because you have worked with your hands. Everyone trusts you. I'll think about it, David said. I'll let you know tomorrow. Later that afternoon, he went to see Peter Arend. Why not? Peter said. Diamond merchant, storekeeper, counselor, he can only do the business good. I wasn't thinking of it that way. It ends up that way. He thought again of what Rosenberg had said. In places where we have no representation, we always end up in ghettos. The Levinsons circled him like emotional wolves, not wanting to demand a response, but wondering all the time what it was going to be. At supper that evening, they ate in silence. He knew they were watching him. What a coup for them it would be. You could just hear Mrs. Levinson. Such a young man. That in itself was enough to make him feel like refusing. But what Rosenberg had said was true, and there was enough anti-Semitic feeling in Kimberley to bring it about. That night after the two older Levinsons had gone to bed, he sat in the sitting room smoking a cigar while Hilda read the weekly paper. They say that the Val River is in flood, she said. He did not reply. It's been the wettest year in living memory. He rose and began to pace up and down the room. She pretended to read the paper but watched him. Finally, he opened the window, threw his cigar out, and closed it. I'll do it, he said. Oh, David! She jumped to her feet. How wonderful! She put her hands on his shoulders and kissed him on the cheek. We're all so proud. He kissed her, a hungry, passionate kiss, and then he held her and heard himself speak. He was asking her to marry him. It was unplanned. It was unplanned, a response to the life he now lived. He saw she was crying, but they were tears of joy, and she ran across the sitting room and down the passage. He could hear her telling her parents. In a few minutes, the three of them entered the room, the old couple in dressing gowns. My boy, Mr. Levinson said, embracing him. Such a person, Mrs. Levinson said. Such a young man. For a second or two, David experienced a sensation of dread. It was as though a door had opened onto a bleak winter landscape, as though something inevitable and irreversible had happened. And he suddenly saw the three people in the room with fresh eyes. The simple and vulgar delight of Mr. Levinson in his dressing gown, Levinson from his Lewisham. He always said jokingly, which was exactly how he looked. And his wife, gross, treble-chinned, wobbly, the calculating eagerness of Hilda. Was she in love with him, or was he simply a convenience which would enable her to enter the respectability of the married state? In another flash of insight, he saw his own childhood in the house in Kiev. Here was no vulgarity, no bad taste. He was a different person from the Levinsons, from a different background, educated, civilized. But by force of will he blotted out such thoughts. In Africa, the past meant little. Everything was new, untried. A whole pristine world beckoned. You could not go through life looking over your shoulder at the past. In this new life, there was the opportunity to be someone, and while he was trying, he would have a secure background and a base. The door on the bleak winter landscape began to close, and he looked again at the family. Here was love and warmth. He was the center of the world. Soon the two old people would go to the Cape in their retirement. Then, if he wished, he could change things, make a life more suited to his style. The door through which the landscape looked so bleak and chill swung slowly too. I'm done. 3 hours. I'm done. Whew. Oh, thick book. Thick. Oh. Done.